So for the third reading today, I've chosen a reading from a professor of religious studies and philosophy called Christopher Bash. And he wrote an extraordinary book, which is called LSD and the Mind of the Universe. And it's a record of a secret series of tests he carried out over a 20-year period, 73 sessions of very high-dose LSD sessions, witnessed only by his own wife. And he recorded the states of consciousness and the cosmologies that emerged during that 20 years. And he wrote this book maybe 2 or 3 years ago. But at some stage in the book, the interviewer asked him a question. As she asked, what was the most important thing he learned from all of these sessions? And he listed 12 items. And I was reading through this list of 12 items. For every single one of these items, I could say, yes, I've had that experience. Yes, that is my belief system. Yes, that is what I've been preaching for many years. I've never done LSD, so there are many ways into this kind of a mindset, but this is a brilliant, absolute synopsis of the mindset and the soul sets and the spirit sets that are available to anybody who takes the time out to do the traveling. Here was his list. That the universe is the manifest body of unimaginable intelligence, compassion, clarity, and power. Secondly, that we are all aspects of this being, never separated from it for a moment. Number 3, that we are growing more aware of this connection. Number 4, that physical reality emerges out of light and returns to light continuously. Number 5, that light is our essential nature and our destiny. Number 6, that all life moves as one. Number 7, that reincarnation is true. Number 8, that there is a deep logic and significance to the circumstances of our lives. Number 9, that everything we do contributes to the evolution of the whole. Number 10, that our awareness continues in an ocean of time and a sea of bliss when we die. Number 11, that we are loved beyond measure. Number 12, that all humanity is driving towards an evolutionary breakthrough that will change us and life on this planet at the deepest level. Words inspired by God. For any of those of you who ever played chess, you know that the last thing you want to do is to kind of lose your queen early on in the game. The queen is the single most versatile piece on the board. And if you lose the early on, you're really screwed. But there was a very, very famous match in 1966 between the current world champion, a guy called Tigran Petrosian, and a guy called Bent Larsen. And Larsen sacrificed his queen very early on in the game, and everybody thought he was crazy. But in 9 or 10 moves forward, it became obvious what he did, and he actually trapped and defeated the champion. And so sometimes an apparently very, very foolish sacrifice early on is necessary to create dividends later than that. And so that's what I want to say. When I'm talking about free will, we sacrificed free will a long, long time ago before incarnation in order to win eternal freedom during incarnation. So we were willing to sacrifice our queen early on in order to score eternal freedom later on. And so as I continue my discussion of free will, I want you to keep that in mind. So I had a totally different beginning planned for today's homily. But then last night, I couldn't sleep. I was feverish all night, and I was having hallucinations. And as I said to you before, When I was in Kenya and I got malaria every year, I would have these extraordinary feverish dreams in which I would have really profound mystical experiences that I then used for homilies and for writing and stuff like that. And so I had such an experience last night about the origin of the universe. And what I saw was that this ludicrous scientific notion, 14.6 billion years ago, there was a big bang, and suddenly it exploded into being and inflated into huge proportions and kept on inflating. And at some stage, it coalesced into cosmologies, stars gathering into galaxies, and then planets formulating. And that went on for 10 billion years before a planet came into existence on which life began to propagate. So for 10 billion years, there was no life in this expanding universe, according to science. And then there's one planet called planet Earth came into being, and it began with single cell creatures, and then multicellular organisms, and then marine life, and then flora, and then fauna, and then human beings, Homo sapiens sapiens, and finally we arrived, and now we're ready for the next stage, which is AI, to become cyborgs that are going to be developed into just machines, and it will be the end of the journey. This is a totally ridiculous mishegas. Here's what really happened. Initially and eternally, there is only God. The problem with that is that since there is only God, no experience is possible. And so if God is Father, Son, and Spirit, Father represents the isness of God, the Son represents God's total self-knowledge, and Spirit represents the love that God has for whom she knows herself to be. But that unity cannot generate experiences because there's nothing outside of itself with which to relate. So that was stage one. Stage two, God decided intentionally to self-fracture into holographic fractals. A hologram is an entity which contains all of the original in every one of its parts. And a fractal is a pattern that repeats at an infinite number of scales. So stage number two was the development of holographic fractals. Now there still was no cosmos at this stage. There were simply holographic fractals of God, bite-sized pieces of God, now separated from the source, so that it was possible for God to begin generating experiences. And then comes what I call pre-cosmic creation contract. So before the cosmos was even created, there's a pre-cosmic creation contract between God and all of the fractals as a group. So the entire group of fractals create a contract. It's a pre-cosmic creation contract because there is no creation yet. There is no cosmos yet. So this group of fractals make an agreement with God. And I'm calling that a pre-cosmic creation contract. And the agreement we made was, we agreed to dive deeper and deeper into separation from source in order to have God imagine, what is it like when she forgets who she is? And then, and only then, was the cosmos created. The cosmos was stage 4. The cosmos was not stage 1. And as the cosmos is being created, the higher dimension, the less the separation. So when 10-dimensional bodies were created, they're less separated from source than, for instance, 3-dimensional realities. And so the first worlds and the first creations were 10-dimensional realities. They're separated from source, but not really badly. By the time you get down to where we are, the lower dimensions, the greater the separation and the sense of separation from source. So by the time you get down to a 3-dimensional world and 3-dimensional human beings, it is really, really difficult. And at that stage, we make a second contract. And I call this the conception contract. Before any individual soul says, okay, sign me up for a three-dimensional experience, then you're going to make a radically different kind. This is radically different from the pre-cosmic creation. But at every stage of these contracts, there is free will. You're freely agreeing to that level of separation from source, so you can contribute to the experiences of God and to your own freedom eventually. So with that as a kind of an introduction, I would like to get into my material. So for me, when I think of consciousness, consciousness I define as source-saturated self-awareness. So ultimately, all consciousness is the remembrance of our God nature. Consciousness is not an artifact of brain activity. That's a ludicrous notion. It is source-saturated self-awareness. And the difference between free will and freedom is that free will is doing as pleases me, whereas freedom is doing as pleases God. And therefore, free will is not the ability to control the outcome, but to control my input. Free will is not the ability to become a dictator, to force my will on others. Rather, it is the realization that I will subsume all of my earthly freedoms during incarnation for the greater good of the evolution of the universe, as I contracted to do before there even was a universe. Because you and I were part of that initial contract that took place before there was a universe. We contracted to provide God with experiences of separation so that the unification process could be all the more beautiful. So we don't need an infinite number of possibilities in order to have free will. All we need is a loving heart, and a loving heart is always free to do as it will. Not to do as it pleases, but to do as it will. Because we act in accordance with God's needs. So when we get down to this three-dimensional reality, life is really, really, really tough, because now we're talking about really basic restraints and rules. And when we volunteer for reincarnation as human beings, particularly, there are four great rules or four great restraints that every single human signs up for. The first one is, when you're born as a little neonate, the realization that I, who was a cosmic being with cosmic extension, are now caught within this little 9-pound ball of flesh. I realized that I, who had cosmic intelligence, am now operating from this tiny little 3-pound laptop. I realized that I, who could grok the entire gestalt of the cosmic plan, that was outlined by God, I can now barely add one on one. And finally, I realized that I have forgotten completely who I am and why I came. And so there are the four basic rules and restraints of incarnation. It's an extraordinary depth of love to sign up for that. Highlight to that, when you actually come in, there are a whole bunch of other specific limitations, depending on the culture into which you parachute, depending on the family dynamic of the family you were born into. And then at an individual level, your own physical body, its limitations, and your own cognitive limitations. And once this starts, there's no script and there's no plot. It's improv theater. We are influencing and being influenced by all of the other players, all their lives and their freedoms. But the important thing again and again and again and again to remember is that each of these limitations was freely agreed upon in our pre-incarnate, by the pre-incarnate soul, before even there was a cosmos. Last week I talked about games theory as a kind of a metaphor for free will. So in some senses, every single incarnation is a different kind of a game. Every dimension is a different game. Every planet is a different domain. Every incarnation, even if you have several incarnations, each one is a different game. And the example I used was, if you take human sports and whether it's golf or soccer or NFL or rugby or hurling, the ball is a different size for each of these. The obstacles are different. In golf, the obstacles are water and sand dunes and high grass and trees. There are different rules. Soccer players can't touch the ball with their hands except if you're a goalkeeper. If the NFL, you're allowed a lot of physical contact and interference with people. The goals are much, much bigger in some games than others. In rugby, for instance, there's a lot of physical interference allowed. And in Irish hurling, which is the fastest of them all, 30 players crashing into each other, left, right, and center, there are very, very different rules. So would you freely agree to accept the limitations of the game once you decide to play the game? So you're not kind of pressured into doing things you don't want. If you want to play hurling, these are the rules that you agree to following. So it becomes really important then to see the game of life as a game in which there are particular rules, restraints that you knew beforehand and you said yes to anyway. And then you realize that pain itself is not just a necessary ingredient, but an extraordinary part of the healing process. I always remember an incident as a young child. I was about 4 years of age. I was living with my grandparents, and my grandfather, whom I call Big Daddy, was a big, big guy. He was about 6'3", beautiful character, great sportsman. He played hurling, really great hurler. And he worked in the biggest hospital in Cork at the time, St. Finbarr's Hospital. He worked as an orderly, just schlepping patients around. But I remember one stage, he got this huge, huge big boil on the back of his neck. It was as big as a baseball, and obviously really, really, really sore. And he consulted my grandmother, my great-grandmother, his mother-in-law, and she gave him a cure, and it was an old Irish cure. And so the cure was to get liquid, fresh cow dung and make a poultice of it and tie it around his neck. And so he invited me to go with him. And we walked from Cork City, where we lived, in Granabraher, out along Blarney Street, which is the longest street in Ireland, all the way from Cork City to the town of Blarney. So it's about 6 miles long. And we walked, he was walking until we found a field with cattle in it. We found the field, we climb over the fence, and he puts his eye on one cow, and he keeps following the cow around the field for the next maybe hour and a half, 2 hours. And as soon as the cow pooped, he ran over, got his handkerchief, filled the handkerchief with this disgusting stuff, tied a poultice, and tied it around his neck. And then we walked home. And I would say within 4 to 5 hours, the boil had disappeared. Now, can you imagine anything as disgusting as putting cow poop around your neck to cure a boil? But it did. And so sometimes it's very important that we learn how to use pain as a poultice to withdraw the poisons from the human psyche. And that for me is the real meaning when it says Jesus died to take away the sins of the world. He didn't do it once and for all, because it needs to be constantly done by living souls. It was a demonstration of what others needed to do. He didn't take away all the sins. There's as much sin in the world now as there was then. But Jesus emptied the cesspit at that stage, and we've been filling it up ever since. I apologize for these kind of graphic images I'm using today. I've lived off the grid up here since 1994, almost 30 years. So I got my own water system, I got my own power system, and I've got my own septic system. So I installed a septic tank in 2005. And then last year, after 16 years, I brought up the honeysucker, a big machine that sucks the underground tanks and cleans them out. So it's good now for about another 16 years. So I'm planning to do it again, actually, on my 100th birthday. So it's like the meta purpose of pain is to kind of suck the poisons from the human psyche. And when you read very carefully the teachings of St. Francis and John of the Cross on the purpose of pain, you get this. Initially, I thought this was kind of craziness to kind of deify pain. I now begin to see that pain is an extraordinary poultice for lacerating the wounds, lancing the wounds at least, and sucking all the poison out of it. So when properly understood and consciously harvested, personal pain can be used as a poultice to draw out the poisons from the collective human psyche. Poisons that come from the confusion of incarnation and the experience of living in competing cultures in separated selves. So to complicate these things, we're physical beings with physical brains. And the physical brain is merely a receiver, a reducer, and a transmitter of consciousness. It's not a producer of consciousness. So when you hear this craziness that consciousness is merely the epiphenomenon of kind of neuronal activity in the brain, that's total ridiculous. The brain does not create consciousness. It's a receiving station from the universe. In fact, it's a reducer, because there's so much coming in that we would be overpowered if we could attend to all of it. So it's a receiver, a reducer, and then a transmitter as well. Jill Bolte-Taylor, I spoke about a few weeks ago, who wrote a book initially called My Stroke of Insight, who had a vicious stroke many years ago that knocked out her entire left hemisphere. So the neocortex on the left, the hippocampus on the left, the amygdala on the left were wiped out completely. So she's operating completely from the right brain. So she cannot distinguish, literally cannot distinguish between herself and a table, or between herself and her mother, or between the inside and the outside. It took her 8 years to learn to speak again and to walk again. In the meantime, she's living in her right brain. She's living in the eternal now, where she's deeply, deeply appreciative of every breath she can take, of every sight she can see. And she's living in a kind of a cosmic unity where everything is connected. Now, that's true for every single one of us. We have those 4 parts within us. We have the ability, to kind of to live in what she calls person number 1, which is the neocortex on the left-hand side, which is important for strategies and planning, and tomorrow's tasks. And number 2, which is, being alerted to present, by present situations, to future dangers or past remembrances. They're important, but they're not that important. Number 3 is the ability to be present to the beauty of the now. And number 4 is the ability to bathe in cosmic unity. And we all have the ability to do that. And she calls that the brain huddle, bringing those parts together. In the meantime, we continue to labor under this ludicrous notion that a newborn baby is tabula rasa, an empty slate, a kind of that we can do with it anything we want. And on the other hand, people who claim that the newborn baby is a pre-programmed robot and there's nothing you can teach it, it's destined to do what it's destined to do. Hinduism is a totally different hit in it. Hinduism has this beautiful mantra that says, I have a body, but I'm not my body. I have emotions, but I am not my emotions. I have an intellect, but I am not my intellect. Oh, so what am I? I'm a bite-sized piece of God having a human experience. I'm a spirit in a spacesuit. I'm a soul on safari on planet Earth. Now, this Earth safari means that there are many, many other actors that are taking part in this drama. Some of these are rocks. Some of them are galaxies. Some of them are ETs. Some of them are flora. And every single one of them is exerting an influence on the outcome. And so it becomes very, very important to realize that we're part of a system, each one of whom is influencing. Now, in the middle of all that, you've got this crazy censorship and propaganda to which you're being subjected right now by what I've called homo sociopathicus, those really, really, really sick people who are trying to create homo artificialis, to make cyborgs of us by taking away all of our freedoms, the destruction of our First Amendment rights, propagating disinformation and misinformation through a captured media, a concerted global effort to shut down both freedom and free will, as if it's not difficult enough to be human beings on planet Earth right now. When Jesus comes along, then he realizes that as 3D beings, we are affected not just by 3D forces, we are also affected by 4D forces and 5D forces, etc. And that's the importance of prayer and intentionality, because prayer and intentionality go beyond the three-dimensionality and have influence in the higher dimensions. And that is how Jesus is able to kind of drive out the demons of illness and mental disorders, because he's pierced these higher levels as well. And he teaches that the paradox that the only truly free person only has one choice. The only truly free person only has one choice. It is to fully awake and unconditionally love. So the only person who's truly free is the person who's making conscious, deliberate decisions to love in all situations. Now, in physics, we know that when two equal energies meet, they either double or amplify or cancel each other. When the energies are unequal, then the stronger one will prevail. And so it can help amplify the weaker ones. And this is the importance of Jesus and healers of various kinds, that their very powerful energy can overcome the weakness of ours, and amplify the amplitude of our wave. So I'd like to say in conclusion then that it's not that we lack free will, but rather that we have forgotten our pre-incarnational plan, which as holographic fractals of source, we formulated before cosmic creation even began. So the invitation of these terrible times is to once more go transpersonal, transspatial, transrational, and to remember that to align with the divinity. The real meta version of free will is that we've chosen before we incarnated. We've chosen to accept these limitations, like a scuba diver agreeing to wearing a big heavy tank on his back and face covering in order to experience the extraordinary underwater world. When Jesus said, "In my Father's house there are many mansions," he wasn't talking about different floors for different religions with the Pentecostals in the bottom because they're a noisy crowd. But he's talking about the fact that heaven is an infinitely evolving series of consciousness states. That we are never done growing, thanks be to God. And so the object of the exercise is to play every level of the game with so much love that we're now ready for the next level of game, which means we have greater abilities, and it means we have greater temptations. Because the higher up the game we go, we get greater abilities and greater temptations. So to make sure that we discharge ourselves at every level to the best of our ability. So when Christ said, for instance, take up your cross daily and follow me into Christ consciousness, that is what he meant. I mean, accepting present vicissitude as a way not just of survival, but of actually evolving the entire system. Christ said, greater love than this has no man than that you lay down your life for your friends. So how do you lay down your life? You lay down your life by volunteering for incarnation. And you do that because of the extraordinary love you have for all cosmic beings. For Jesus then, when he said there is more joy in heaven over one brave soul who chooses incarnation in the 3D dimension than over 99 timid souls who want to stay in heaven with Daddy. And so in subsequent incarnations, a single soul will play very different sports, each with a different set of rules and restraints, but all involving free will on the part of the pre-incarnate soul. Please remember then that you volunteered to be here, and you volunteered to be here now. I want to tell you, soul to soul, that you are an amazing being. Please stay faithful to your vow.